This is Camille Jones. I am actually sharing my favorite theory in slide presentation format, and I've chosen to discuss narrative therapy in the context of how we might apply narrative therapeutic techniques to facilitate empowerment of clients, of youthful clients, through the use of hip-hop translanguaging to help those impacted by defeatist and or extremist life events in Seine-Saint-Denis, France. Seine-Saint-Denis is often referred to as SSD, and that's how it's going to be referred to hereafter. Key concepts of narrative therapy are: narrative therapists believe that our stories shape the reality that we construct and constitute what we see, feel, and do. And so the theory is that if you change stories that people, if you tweak the stories that people ascribe to their lives, you can change both the client and the therapist. How do you do that? You establish collaborative approach, you listen respectfully, you use questions to facilitate exploration, you help the client map out where the problem is, you listen to them without blame, you listen for their strengths, you help them personify the problem, externalizing it from a sense of who they may be. The reasons for being a favorite therapy: what makes the problem rather than the person. It helps with externalization, which is key in some sociocultural contexts. It helps us to recognize that problems often are the products of cultural worlds clients live in. It allows for alternative outcomes permissible by also building on the competences that a client may have within that he may or may not have recognized. And for multicultural clients, it allows the therapy to be a venue for reauthoring the social constructions or narratives that they find problematic. The setting for this therapy would be Seine-Saint-Denis. This slide just gives you some statistical information and background about that. Highest department in France with the highest proportion of immigrants, I should say, many of whom are under the age of 18 and come from African origins. And African is the larger 19th century sense, which includes 22% from Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and 16% from sub-Saharan Africa. It's also the area, per circa 2018, that has the highest proportion of people without papers, who are not regularized, and also high levels of poverty. Other data beyond the therapeutic setting: this is a recent survey from last year that asked survey respondents if they had mistrust toward the residents of Seine-Saint-Denis, and the answer was yes, by 73%. Also, mistrust toward people living in the cités or the housing projects, 83% said yes. Additionally, people had the impression, 84% had the impression that Seine-Saint-Denis is basically a place that's inhabited by youth, that the communities are poor, 79% felt that, 71% saw it as dangerous, only 44% saw solidarity amongst the people there, and only 36% of the respondents felt that there was cultural or religious tolerance there. And similarly, only 36% saw it as a creative environment, and only 37% saw it as a place full of initiative and energy. So the disconnect is that, yes, there's a lot of creativity that abounds in Seine-Saint-Denis once you actually know the terrain. The expected clients would be youth and adolescents from Seine-Saint-Denis, but because of the amazing diversity there's just not going to be one narrative story to tell, which is part of the beauty of the approaches we would use. So the idea would be to use the therapeutic techniques to help the clients use languages they're familiar with, hip-hop languages, to offer them greater voice in a constructive way in a setting where they very often are ascribed pejorative associations. Understanding hip-hop would mean knowing French, but French in the terrain as well, slang French, and also Kabyle or the other languages that might translanguage to their hip-hop. Therapeutic techniques would mean helping to deconstruct the problem, working on helping them to devise unique outcomes, making a new story, maybe authoring and reauthoring that story, remembering it, and celebrating it. The basis for the interventions: 2015 was really the lightning rod time for Seine-Saint-Denis. There were riots in mid-2000s in France, but in 2015, France underwent a spate of terrorist attacks, and as you may recall, some of the groups that were associated with those terrorist attacks were located in Seine-Saint-Denis. So this had a profound impact upon people's sense of safety and public opinion. The Charlie Hebdo attacks were really the ones that crystallized people's understanding that France had homegrown challenges that no one had fully understood. You can read the rest of this information about what the psychologist said. The Kouachi brothers were the two perpetrators of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. This slide just speaks to Je suis Charlie, the journalists, the cartoonists, and the creators that were impacted by the attacks. The upshot here is that all groups were targeted in this attack, However, someone hiding under the table giving witness afterwards indicated that whoever the perpetrators were, they had absolutely no accent. They sounded as if they came from Paris. And that was the moment in which I think the average French person realized that they could no longer see the threat as coming from thousands of miles away, that there was a new sense of other. So what the therapeutic process would be empower the kids through creative repurposing of narratives, using hip hop, a terrain that they really use to express themselves. Hip hop is defined differently by every neighborhood. I'm mentioning here on this slide some of the people I've listened to in the past. Sheer Day, as early as 2004, would use in his tropes, "We have the ability to be rejected." That was an identifier. And then Blas would also talk about things that were even darker, using face masks and things that you really associate with extremists in the last several years. But the notion is that as things got worse in France with social services, with the Sarkozy era, and they started raising the neighborhoods, that made more kids live in precarity and be more inclined to listen for survival purposes to narratives that were probably much more nihilistic and destabilizing for all. The benefits from this therapy, therefore, is if you work with a therapist who understands hip-hop narratives in France, hip-hop in France is different from hip-hop in the States, you can have a rapport with your client, you can develop some sense of respect and authenticity, sincerity, invite them to tweak the models and narrate their own story and express in authentic ways. This is a slide that shows Sheer Day from 2007. Here's Sheer Day from the last year. His last flow was La Psychiatrie. That's him in the face mask, which is a tad bit troubling. Another point that's important for looking at these hip hop stories is that sometimes when the kids are in their bled, in the bled, which is their parents' home country, without their parents, of course, their storying is different from what they talk about in the hood. So here's a picture of Blas. Blas on the left side, a very dark narrative of Épinay Viltaneuse. Blas on the right side, happy, tourist, utopic, and he's with his family, as who he perceives as his family on the right. Some disconnect there, and narrative therapy can help with that. In other cases, kids go to the parents' home country and they do really aggressive things. Lalim and microaggressions, he's seen here stealing basically a Mercedes-Benz from a local gentleman to take it on a joyride, and then they returned it, the car it was out of gas and it wouldn't function anymore. So it's microaggressions against the parent culture that narrative therapy can help with. Political slide here that talks about how people think the problem will be solved. You'll see that most French people said, in terms of politics, they don't think any group can do it. 43% said none, but 20% said the extreme right, which would be Front National. The others fell below, and that suggests there are some problems ahead for France and for us. So we want to use our therapeutic sessions with these kids to help them use the music to initiate interaction and then have the therapeutic sessions more traditional ways. The choice of the tropes are crucial. We want to use tropes that are generationally inclusive and culturally inclusive, and there's some suggestions there. The reauthoring is important because very often kids see themselves in the way they've been projected in the media. Racaille is a term that Sarkozy used to use to describe the kids as scum who needed to be power washed away. So when kids believe that narrative, they're more likely to spin into continuations of that and buy into utopic tropes that operate from that narrative and do things that destabilize us all. So we want them to reauthor their identity and make powerful, constructive choices that really give them better skills. So questioning techniques can help them drill down how also they might share it and what AKAs they would use. There's a lot of threats to kids in this community in Saint-Denis. A lot of things impact their therapeutic journey: relocations, deportations, juvie justice, poverty, homelessness, violence, and family aggressions. But it's a very, very empowering terrain to work with them on, to meet them on the terrain, and to get them engaged in therapeutic processes that can be empowering for them and for the counselor. Last thought, Paris is going to have the Olympic Games in 2024. Saint-Denis is going to be the venue for many of those places. So I would encourage you to stay tuned for the retelling ahead. Thank you so much.